Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
This week, Mike and Jude are joined by U.S. Ambassador to Sri Lanka, Chung. They discuss how geopolitical competition in Sri Lanka has developed in recent years.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joined by my friend and colleague, Jude Blanchett, and honestly, one of my favorite diplomats in the world, Ambassador Chung, the U.S. Ambassador to Sri Lanka. We're going to talk about Sri Lanka. We'll talk about geopolitical competition, how it looks from the view of a country like Sri Lanka and why Sri Lanka matters to us, and some of the plays on the chessboard as they appear in Colombo. But Julie, thanks for joining us.
Of course. Happy to talk to you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So we always start, as you may know, by asking our guests how they got into this business. You've had an amazing career. I've crossed paths with you in some of the most interesting places at some of those most interesting times. We've gone jogging in downtown Pyongyang. You were my guide. We've had pho in Hanoi, and I think we had dinner at your residence in Phnom Penh while tanks were in the street. Most recently, I saw you in Sri Lanka. And I've told my wife, if I ever write an adventure novel about an American diplomat, it'll be at least partly based on you. But you kind of got into all this, and your career, I should add, before Sri Lanka, included running the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau at State Department, the Japan desk, a lot of Korea work. But you, as a little girl in Huntington Beach, California, were probably not thinking you'd be jogging with some weird White House guy in Pyongyang or Ambassador Sri Lanka. So how did that happen?
That's right. Well, my family immigrated from Seoul, Korea to the United States when I was 5 years old. And I went to school at UC San Diego thinking I would be a journalist, actually. I wrote for my high school and college papers. I was really interested in the world, global affairs, studying Japanese and Spanish. And one day I saw a flyer in the Career Center that said, Woodrow Wilson Foreign Affairs Fellows wanted. And it was an application to apply for the State Department as a Foreign Service Officer program. Now, I had no idea what that was. In our Asian family, you had two choices, be a lawyer or doctor. Certainly not an FSO. That was not in the cards. But I thought, well, I want to see the world. I want to learn languages. I want to serve my country. So I got this fellowship, which is now called the Thomas R. Pickering Fellowship. And I joined as the very first cohort of that Pickering Fellowship. Since 1996, haven't stopped, and I can't imagine doing anything else now.
So you want to say just a bit about what the Pickering Fellowship is, because we've had some terrific Pickering Fellows at Georgetown, and I've seen them in service and embassies around the region. What is the Pickering Fellowship?
Yeah, it's a competition, and it's really to draw more diversity into the State Department and the Foreign Service ranks. So that first year, they had 10 of us from around the country of all different backgrounds, again, to increase the diversity ranks in the Foreign Service. So once you get in, you have to take the exam. You're actually required to get a master's degree, which is beyond the regular requirements of the State Department. And then they kind of give you through an internship and mentoring program to get you ready for a career in the Foreign Service. And it's a great program. It's been continuing since that very first year in 96. I joined actually in 92 when I was a sophomore in college. And I'm really happy to see it thriving and see many generations of Pickerings thriving there now.
And as I said, I've seen them doing really well and really interesting people from diverse backgrounds, making the Foreign Service stronger. So Sri Lanka, why should our hard-headed Northeast Asia expert sitting in Washington or Tokyo or Canberra care about Sri Lanka strategically?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit. As you know, Mike, I served in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia and worked a lot with PACOM. And through the years, I've noticed that lexicon changed. We thought about the broader Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific, and which PACOM became Indo-PACOM. So there's a lot of synergy between Northeast, Southeast Asia to South Asia. And we're better than Sri Lanka at the heart of that Indo-Pacific in South Asia. And some people may not know how strategically located it is as a maritime nation. 2/3 of the world's seaborne crude oil, half the container ships, all Navy vessels passing between the 5th and 7th fleets actually transit the waters by Sri Lanka. So very critical in our maritime security and the whole sphere of Indo-Pacific issues.
And historically, people may know that in both the First World War and the Second World War, Sri Lanka was a major target for the Germans in the First World War, the Japanese in the Second World War because of everything you said. Even then, it was such a critical midway point in the Indian Ocean and the ability of the British and then the Americans to swing between theaters. And that hasn't changed, right? It's still as critical, if not more so.
That's right. And I've gone diving into the shipwrecks, British ships that were bombed during World War II that still lie beneath the waters. And we were actually, through an Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, helping to preserve a 2,000-year-old shipwreck right near Hambantota port. So there's a lot of that maritime history and heritage that's here in Sri Lanka. And besides the maritime security aspect, of course, the democracy and governance, there was a very brutal civil war here, a lot of issues with governance, reconciliation, and accountability that we're still advocating for here in Sri Lanka.
Of course, in World War I and World War II, when Sri Lanka was the scene of battles and an object of strategic competition, it was Ceylon, it was a British colony. It's now an independent country, like most, trying to avoid choosing in geopolitical competition. But to put it crudely, whose side is Sri Lanka on?
Well, hopefully Sri Lanka is on Sri Lanka's side. And as it endeavors to be a sovereign nation, that it stands up and has the capacity and ability to make decisions that really bring the benefits to its own people. That's what we're hoping. That's what we believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific, that Sri Lanka has the ability to make those decisions independently without any pressure by any country.
And how would you describe the state of relations with the U.S. right now?
Well, last year we celebrated the 75th year anniversary of relationships, and we had a banner year of so many events. We had a carrot multilateral exercise. We had Senator Van Hollen from Maryland come visit. His father was a U.S. ambassador here 50 years ago. We have a whole range of USAID programs, youth programs, assistance, and economic ties that are really expanding through every aspect of our relationship. So it's very strong. I would say we have been really building up this relationship for many years. And there's a mutual trust and mutual understanding as two democracies in the Pacific that we have a lot in common and a lot of challenges that we can address together.
So Senator Van Hollen's sister, by the way, of course, is Cecilia Van Hollen, who teaches South Asian studies at Georgetown, kept that Sri Lanka and India bug. When you talk to government officials, politicians in Colombo, they know they're an object of great power competition. They've known that for a long time, of course. India, of course, intensely focused on the relative influence of great powers in Sri Lanka, worried about China. The Chinese targeting, as we'll discuss in a minute, Hambantota and access for the Philippine Navy and other maritime forces from China and so forth. But when Sri Lankan senior officials look at it, do you sense there's a consensus in Colombo about what they have to do to preserve their sovereignty? Are they divided about it? Often you find in countries like Sri Lanka, it's not really about the US and China. It's about other things like India or their other neighbors. How does it look within Colombo to the elites? What are the views of the US, of China, of strategic competition?
Sri Lanka looks really closely at its near neighbors like India, of course, and Bangladesh and Nepal, the South Asian regions. It's right now the chair this year of the IORA, the Indian Ocean Regional Platform. So they're really focused on the Indian Ocean itself. And at the same time, they maintain a non-aligned presence. They say we don't have enemies to none, friends to all. So they really try to maintain that foreign policy outlook. At the same time, we have so much synergy and so much mutual interest together. Just recently, Sri Lanka volunteered to send a vessel to the Operation Prosperity Guardian, right? And that was seen by some as taking sides, even though it was U.S.-led. It was really to maintain the global shipping lanes and secure that from the Houthi rebel attacks. And for Sri Lanka as a shipping nation, it's in its own self-interest to be a part of that and part of that coalition that says, no, we don't stand for piracy. We really want to maintain the shipping lanes that affect not only Sri Lanka's exports and imports, but that's so critical for global shipping. So I think Sri Lanka is making those decisions now, looking at the sovereign decisions, knowing that it does feel like it is a small island nation and it must maintain good relations with everybody.
What did they send for the operation to protect the sea lanes against the Houthis?
It was a Coast Guard cutter that was actually gifted from the United States to Sri Lanka. So it's one of the 3 Coast Guard cutter ships that we have given to maintain maritime security, whether it's to combat drug trafficking, human smuggling, to HADR. And so we're actually just announced the gifting of another 4th cutter next year. So they have contributed to that participation of that OPG. And that's just one symbol of what Sri Lanka can do, how it can step up in the Indo-Pacific, that it can play a responsible role, and it doesn't have to stand by and watch other countries do it.
And was that a controversial decision within Colombo? Did they come under pressure from under third unnamed parties not to participate?
I think there was a divided in the public opinion about that. Those who understood, again, the meaning behind that and the meaning of global shipping lanes and protection of that understood the meaning of that. Some opposed it, saying, why are you joining an operation led by the United States? Does this mean you're joining forces with Israel? Of course it doesn't. But that kind of messaging was often spread here and a lot of misinformation spread about it. But I think ultimately the president himself and the government and the Navy all were in agreement. This is what's good for Sri Lanka's own sovereignty and Sri Lanka's own security.
So as Sri Lanka tries to preserve its freedom of action, its sovereignty in an intensifying global geopolitical game and incredible pressure on them, which we'll talk about more, one of the areas that was most fascinating to me when I was in Sri Lanka, when we saw you in September, was the whole competition over the truth, the information, disinformation, cognitive warfare game, where a lot of disinformation about Ukraine, about Taiwan, about AUKUS, the US, UK, Australia submarine deal, a lot of disinformation seems to course through the veins of Sri Lankan political discourse. What's your sense of that? Is there much the US or our allies and partners can do in this narrative game? Or maybe it's not as bad as it seemed to me when I was visiting. What do you think?
No, and it's not new. Disinformation, misinformation, and culture of conspiracy theories has been really pervasive here for many years. Several years ago, the United States also had been discussing with Sri Lanka about an MCC, a Millennium Corporation Challenge Account, which would have given a $500 million grant to Sri Lanka to help with its infrastructure, land titling. There was a heavy campaign of disinformation against that. There were hunger strikes and union striking, and they were claiming that the U.S. was going to take over Sri Lanka and build military bases, all of which was untrue. But because of that, eventually, we never went through with the MCC. It was withdrawn, and then the money eventually went to Nepal. So that's an unfortunate result and impact. I think there's some buyer's remorse or a sense of remorse that Sri Lanka lost out on that because they let the misinformation spiral out of control. And what do we do with this environment? We just try to speak the truth. We get information out there. We talk to journalists. We talk to think tanks. We do a lot of training too, so that people and journalists can recognize misinformation and report truth and do investigative journalism to prevent that in the future. I think there's a general sense of that and acknowledgement that has to be really something that people have to stay vigilant towards, and especially during this election year. This is a presidential election here in Sri Lanka as well as the United States. And I'm sure we'll see more of that. But certainly against the United States, many other countries, we see that disinformation really continuing to play out here.
I wonder if I can ask a quick follow-up to a previous question by Mike before I ask you about China's relationship with Sri Lanka. And that is something that I've noticed when Mike and I have had conversations with countries in ASEAN across Southeast Asia is, although they don't like the growing geopolitical tensions and are obviously quite wary of being caught in the crossfire, there's something of a sweet spot right now for many countries, given that geopolitical competition means US and China are both vying essentially for attention. And Sri Lanka is quite interesting, right? As you were saying earlier, it sits at this nexus of two geopolitical competitions, India, China, and the US and China. And I wonder, for all the risks and downsides and challenges this presents, do you hear much strategic thinking about utilizing this moment for opportunities?
We do. We hear Sri Lanka talk about building relationships with every country. It does say it doesn't want to be forced to make choices, and we certainly don't ask for Sri Lanka to choose between us or any other country. What we can offer is alternatives, right? Whether it's an investment, financing, and maritime security, partnerships, relationships, show that we are a good partner. We alongside like-minded partners like India, like Australia, like Japan, many others here, and to help really build the capacity of Sri Lanka. And I can't speak for Sri Lanka's relationship with China. You'll have to ask the government about that. But we can offer what we can as longstanding partners. And I believe we have a good story to tell.
Oh, well, given that you've said I should only ask the Sri Lankan government about its relationship with China, let me find a way to reword my question such that you can ask it. As an analyst of politics around the region, longtime Asia hand, I'd like to get your sense of the complexity of the Sri Lanka-China relationship. I think certainly in the United States, really since 2017, 2018, if people think of Sri Lanka, they really just think of it in the context of the Hambantota port and just a narrative of debt trap diplomacy. But of course, the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Colombo is far more complex than this. So I wanted to ask you about a few specifics, but just at a macro level, could you just sort of sketch out some of the complexity of the Sri Lanka-China relationship as you see it on the ground, including, but maybe in addition to just this idea of China as an external lender?
Yeah, they've had a long historical relationship. There's been a rubber pact between Sri Lanka and China, and a lot of visits back and forth. And certainly on the people-to-people scale and government visits, they've had ongoing positive relationships with the PRC. Now, recently, a few months after I got here, there was a complete economic collapse. Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy. We had queues around the blocks of people lining up for fuel, a complete, utter kind of stagnation of economic conditions, and people were out in the streets protesting. It was really a time of political instability. And now, as they are on the path of their 17th IMF program, we and our partners in the Paris Club are working towards ensuring and helping Sri Lanka get to a, get well, stay well program on debt restructuring so that it's manageable, so that they are not vulnerable to any debt distress by any country. And that's including, making their own macroeconomic policies that are really beneficial and sustainable in the long run for its population. As we talk about the PRC in that context, I think there's more of an awareness because even though a lot of the debt is due to a variety of lenders, including multilateral banks and private share bondholders, the largest bilateral creditor is China to Sri Lanka. So they do have to take that into account. Out of, the $46 billion, $8 billion is to China, largely to China Exim and the China Development Bank. So if it wants to manage its debt in a really sustainable way in the future, it does have to think about that bilateral loan and what the benefit is to the people. It's one thing to have a loan and to be able to manage it, but what is the return on investment? What is the return on the benefits to the Sri Lankan people? These are the questions that Sri Lanka has to ask in the context of its relationship with the PRC. And right now, they're still, by the way, going through the debt restructuring talks. And what we and the Paris Club and others have been really asking for is equal, comparable treatment for all. That means nobody gets a secret deal. Nobody gets anything extra, that we are all treated equally and comparably. They have yet able to reach that final agreement. We're hopeful that they'll get there. But that means the PRC also has to share information with the Paris Club and others and make sure that we all come to a same understanding.
The issue of debt and sort of debt trap diplomacy has always somewhat confounded me, or at least confounded a simple narrative, because 5 or 6 years ago, the idea was that it was a one-way transmission belt and that essentially China was buying direct influence over states that were taking on Chinese debt. Now the story is quite different. And in some ways, some of China's external debt is the equivalent of if you owe the bank $1, it owns you. If you owe it $1 million, you own the bank. And China now, in some countries, scrambling to restructure debt, get it off the books. How is your just sort of broad narrative of China as an external lender and where you find it problematic? How has that evolved after just being on the ground in a country that is dealing, on the front lines with this? Do you see this as universally problematic, universally beneficial in the sense that it's tying China to some bad assets, or somewhere in between?
Well, if you to look beyond Sri Lanka, beyond the region, globally, how many countries are in debt to the PRC? And what type of debt that is. So whether you look at Zambia or Pakistan or any of those other countries, what is that debt total to and what does it involve? What kind of projects? So you look at projects here like Hambantota Port, which was a loan of $300 million at a very high interest rate of 6%. You look at Matala Airport, labeled the emptiest airport in the world. You look at Lotus Tower, which they just had some bungee jumpers get injured the other week. What are the return on investment for these projects? It's not just about the loan itself, the money, but what benefits are they bringing? And I think these are questions that the Sri Lankan people are asking and starting to ask, that a loan in itself and projects in itself, if they don't undergo really clean procurement, clean transparency measures, looking at environmental labor standards, it could be problematic later. And so it's not just a question for Sri Lanka, Zambia, and others. I think many countries look at that the debt and make sure whatever debt it is, it can be managed and that it brings a return on investment.
You anticipated my next question nicely, which is, again, the narrative out here with the challenge of distance is we can oftentimes assess China's relationships and how it's building, strengthening, developing based on a sort of superficial veneer of government to government ties, missing below the surface complexity of how oftentimes a capital's relationship with Beijing at a financial level is actually building tensions below the surface where citizens of that country become frustrated as they see China up front. This is happening across Africa. But as you talk to Sri Lankans, are you able to get a sense of how an average Sri Lankan is viewing the capital's relationship with Beijing? Do they see Beijing as an economic lifeline, as an important trade partner? Or do you see any tension starting to emerge as they've seen China up close?
I think the general public appreciates all relationships with countries, and any country that can offer investments, offer trade, offer assistance. It's not something they would reject, right? Especially during the economic crisis. They would receive that assistance from any country. But certainly the questions are being asked about what type of investments and infrastructure projects that would, again, be beneficial in the long run and that's sustainable. And that's where it's becoming useful to really have a public discourse, to have a really well-knowledgeable, aware public that asks these questions of their own government before they sign away things. And even right now in Colombo Port City, where the PRC also has a lot of investment in there, there's for many years, it was just a pile of dirt, and it's just starting to emerge as, a duty-free store and maybe some entertainment centers. But as they give these 40-year tax concessions, I think the public is asking, how are these tax concessions decided on? Who is divvying it up? Who is benefiting? So the more that we see that discourse, more we welcome, because again, it doesn't matter whether an investment or a loan is from China or India, the United States or France or anywhere. These basic structural values of transparency and clear procurement rules and level playing field, as long as those things are met, it's not that the United States would oppose any kind of investment from any country. We want to support Sri Lanka as it builds out its capacity, its immunity to taking on bad loans or bad projects.
Final question for me is on the military side. There have been sort of rumors swirling around for a while about a prospective Chinese military facility. Rumors it might be a radar base, others the Sri Lankan government has come out to deny these. I'm curious, are these denials sufficient for you, or do you have any concerns that China might be targeting Sri Lanka as a potential future military base or facility?
Well, you've seen from our ODNI report in February of this year that refers to Sri Lanka, amongst other countries, that the PRC and the PLA have been building up establishment of military installations across the world, including in Djibouti, Tajikistan, and Seychelles. And Cambodia, where I served as the deputy chief of mission several years ago. And we used to go down to Ream Naval Base and lovely beach area, some casinos. And everybody was told, no, we would never give this Ream Naval Base over to the PRC. And now we see PRC warships kind of parked there for months at end. And that is a sign of caution. There is intent. There is potential intent. And as we look at how Sri Lanka fits into that with dual-use research vessels that have been coming in here, and looking at the intent of ship-to-ship refueling close by, the Sinopec refinery that's due to be built out this year. These are legitimate questions to ask about PRC intent and Sri Lanka's intent as they respond to such actions.
So, Julie, when you were in Cambodia at Sharjah, we met then because I was 16. I was mostly sitting at the pool at the Hotel Royal trying to write a book while my wife traveled around the country doing real work. That was a really interesting time to be in Cambodia because that's when the tribunal decision came down on the Philippine case. China got crushed. The expectation was that ASEAN would put out some kind of ASEAN statement, nothing hardline, but basically telegraphing that the members of ASEAN needed China to negotiate in good faith. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen in part because Cambodia used the ASEAN consensus rule to break that response from the group. So we've kind of lost, I think generally the U.S. it was a real blow. I think the U.S., Japan, Australia, a lot of countries lost whatever faith they had that we could use regional groupings. ASEAN is in turmoil now. We talk about the Pacific Island Forum as one way to help get countries in the Pacific Islands to compare notes, to police each other, to set norms, and basically help all of the member states be more resilient and frankly more immune to external pressures and interference. So it's kind of back in the PIF. You don't hear much about SARC in U.S. strategy. I'm sure you hear it in the region, the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, which of course Sri Lanka is a member of, Maldives, India, and so forth. Is SARC of any use at all to us or to Sri Lanka in trying to deal with this? It sounds like the U.S. has a pushback, not all of it indigenous to Sri Lanka, about our Millennium Challenge account grant programs. It goes to Nepal. Chinese look for military access and influence, get a little pushback in Sri Lanka, go to the Maldives. It doesn't seem like the SARC member countries are really comparing notes enough. But is that wrong? Is there some utility in the SARC for Sri Lanka and for us as we look at ways to help Sri Lanka and other countries be more resilient?
Yeah, Mike, as you know, I worked a lot with ASEAN and my several tours in Southeast Asia, and I think they just have a stronger organizational structure and network than I've seen either in SARC or even IORA. Sri Lanka's talked a lot about IORA and BIMSTEC and other regional groupings that they can work in, they want to work in. I just haven't seen that organizational level at the secretariat level really step up as we've seen in ASEAN. By the way, did you know that when ASEAN was first established, Sri Lanka was invited to be one of the members of ASEAN, and they actually had been considering it at the last minute, decided not to join. So imagine that the history would have been followed if Sri Lanka had actually been a part of ASEAN, really connecting that Southeast Asia to South Asia connectivity. You ask a good question about regional groupings. Sri Lanka is stepping into that role, sees its role, I think, more in the Indo-Pacific, and wants to work with countries in the region, whether it's to develop maritime security or look at port security. And we want to lean into that. And that's why we've worked a lot with the Sri Lankan Ports Authority here. Just this morning, we had an event, the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, which has its main event in Manila this week, as you know. But we had a satellite event today here in Sri Lanka, really focusing on ports, because we know how important that port infrastructure is here, talking about how to make ports sustainable, decarbonize, digitalize, fight cybersecurity or beef up cybersecurity against cyber attacks. So there's a way that we can work with our partners to help Sri Lanka strengthen its capacity, but in that way, then it can strengthen its role in their regional groupings as well.
So Julie, you're describing a U.S. relationship with Sri Lanka where our goals and Sri Lanka's goals are generally aligned. We want, with a lot of our relations in the region, countries to be resilient. We want them to be free to make choices. We want them to be developing. We don't want them to be coerced. It's not one of these things where you're with us or against us. We just want them to be able to make choices without coercion. But a key part of that, of course, is all the questions you say people are asking and should be asking about debt traps, about infrastructure and so forth. Those are questions that are going to be better answered if Sri Lanka has a well-functioning parliament, free press, good civil society. So even though we're aligned with Sri Lanka's interests, we do have our own interest in kind of pushing for better democracy and governance, even if it gets scratchy, right? So how is that going? I know you're an advocate of this and you're a diplomat, so you know how to do it effectively, but how is that going? We do have to worry about that with countries like Sri Lanka. The decisions and discussions you've described need to be transparent and open to and accountable to the people, right? So how do you find that's going?
That's exactly right. I feel like there is a crossroads right now in Sri Lanka, especially after the economic crisis, that it wasn't just an economic crisis governance issue. It was a overall governance crisis, which means economic reforms must go hand in hand with governance reforms. You can't just do tax reform and public financial reform and expect that to be enough. That's not what the people, I think, really are demanding of their government. They want full accountability across the board, fighting corruption, doing all these structural reforms beyond what the IMF is requiring. And even though those are critical, like, restructuring state-owned enterprises, that it goes beyond that to look at how democratic governance, how people respond to its institutions, how people can be more confident in their institutions. That is the really crux of the future of Sri Lanka. So we've been emphasizing to them as they look at some of these new legislation that crack down on freedom of expression, on online bills and NGO bills, this risk to governance is going to affect its economic governance because the two are intertwined. And that is not going to bode well for the future of Sri Lanka. So it must really tend to all aspects, including looking at its reconciliation and accountability measures. When a country doesn't make every single citizen of all backgrounds whole, you don't have the potential. You're losing the potential to really thrive as a country. So governance means economic and democratic governance all in one. And this is the moment in time when Sri Lanka, as it steps forward through this election year and beyond, to make those choices that really will benefit its citizens.
So you hear from realists and faux realists in Washington and Canberra and elsewhere that in this strategic competition with China, we can't be pushing democratic values. We got to play China's game. You're in the front lines and sounds like you're saying, no, that is totally wrong. Governance, democracy, it's got to be done, in Sri Lanka's way, but it is fundamentally a strategic question, is what I hear you saying.
That's right. I mean, everything we do, whether it's supporting civil society's ability to speak up or journalists' ability to have that freedom of expression, or even economically, when we put in $500 million financing through DFC, that goes into private sector financing. This does not add to the government debt, but works with private sector companies to look at market economy reforms and to spur growth and productivity through the private sector and not state-owned enterprises. What all this shows, what I hope it shows and demonstrates, the U.S. is committed to Sri Lanka. We're here to support its people. And no matter who is in that presidency, no matter what party is in power, that we will continue to work to support the people. And we did that during the economic crisis, right? We provided fertilizer, we provide school lunch programs, we provide SME support, entrepreneurial support, all the amazing American corners around the country to teach the young people of this country English and STEM education. This is all to show that we want to see a strong Sri Lanka. A strong Sri Lanka means a strong United States. We have much to benefit when Sri Lanka is prosperous and stable and addresses the needs of all its people.
Shortly after the 2016 election, when I was teaching at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, which I think still provides more foreign service officers than any school, a lot of the students were saying, we have no foreign policy now. That election turned out the wrong way, and so on and so forth. So I took a group of students to meet Ambassador Chung when she was the Japan desk director, just to talk about Japan. And when we were going back to Georgetown afterwards, 3 students said, you know what, Professor, that was awesome. I'm going to apply for the Foreign Service exam. You are a fine example in every sense of what American diplomacy can do at its best. We're lucky to have you on the show, and the American taxpayers are lucky to have you in Colombo. Thanks very much, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me. I said this again, but I can't imagine doing anything else. I love what we do as diplomats. And I think there's so much we can do in the region and the world. It comes down to values, democratic values. And I do believe Sri Lanka and the United States share those basic democratic values. We have challenges. Neither of us are perfect democracies for sure, but we're working on it. It's a relationship we believe in and we invest in. And so I have a lot of faith and optimism in the future, especially when I meet the young people here. There's a lot of hope and optimism that if they stay on this track of good reforms, transparency, good governance, that the country not only will come out of its economic crisis, but really build a thriving democracy that really be a shining example in the Indo-Pacific.
Hear, hear. Thanks, Julie. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.